So while she is still on here, I want to thank Ashley, who has helped facilitate my entry into the 21st century.
You're very welcome.
What, Ashley?
I said you're very welcome. It was an easy transition.
Well, it's been a long time coming, so thank you.
The handout has appeared.
Well, I am going to make it appear even more.
Oh, you're going to share your screen? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, how's that?
Okay.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure it worked. I'm not ready to throw it out there yet, but yeah. Oh, thank you, Ashley. Now I'm in the spotlight. There's mirror. So, okay. But I want to make sure I can see everybody at once, except for you folks who are on the phone. Okay.
I don't have a camera on my computer.
Yeah, well, sorry about that. They got me this really inexpensive one, Barbara. So, you know, there's probably a bunch of them out there.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
You're just coming into focus there. That's good.
Yeah, I had my cover on my. I usually cover my webcam when I'm not using it on purpose. You've heard stories like, you know, the Mossad, people like that can activate and watch what you're doing when you don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not worried about it.
Well, I wouldn't worry if they were watching me. I'm not sure how much they would see. So, hi, Francois.
Hi, Rabbi.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. So, if you saw what I'm going to share with everybody now, right, you know what the topic is going to be for tonight. And so here is this verse that we live with in the Torah. And some of you may be perfectly comfortable with having this in the Torah. I assure you there is a significant percentage of the Jewish people who are not so comfortable with it. And when we have verses and subjects that are uncomfortable, you know, the temptation is, you know, to either ignore it or to kind of rip it out if you could. I tend to take the approach that we should tackle it, and we could see, you know, if we can live with it in one way or another, that's good. We try to maintain fidelity to the Torah while still questioning what the Torah contains at times. So this section of the Torah, which I know is familiar to all of you who come on Yom Kippur afternoon, right? This section of the Torah is called the Arayot. It's not really a word, but Arayot translates as nakednesses. Okay? It is a list of sexual relationships that are forbidden to Israelite men, including various forms of incest, careful there, bestiality, and apparently homosexual relationships. And its meaning seems to be quite obvious, but for many Jews today, it's very difficult to take at face value. And we all know that the Torah has at its core the message that Israel must not despise or abuse those who are weak, those who are outnumbered among us. And, it's hard for many of us to accept the idea that a loving relationship between two consenting adults is a toeva. It's an abhorrence, right? So, how have people tried to deal with this? Obviously, there are those who, within the Jewish community, at least most of the Jewish community up until the middle of the 20th century, and certain parts of it today, who have no trouble with the verse or with the implications of it. Okay? For the rest of us, how do we respond to it? Okay? So, here is one approach. We all understand that there are different types of laws. I've mentioned in class before, but some of you have probably not heard this, that there are 4 different types of Jewish law. One of them is ethical. Okay? Certain laws are supposed to make us more ethically refined. Okay? A second kind of law is national laws, laws that celebrate certain things with the Jewish people. We just had Yom HaAtzmaut. That's a national celebration, right? Passover, the anniversary of our redemption from slavery. That's a national holiday, right? And by the way, of course, many practices in Judaism have more than one reason associated with them, and that's fine. The third kind of law is reflexive, right? A reflexive law is just something that makes you, it's there to make you think about something, right? It is, prayer, among other things, it's lahit palel, it's a reflexive verb. And so part of the purpose for prayer is to make us, not just to talk to God, but to make us think about what we ought to be doing. How do we respond to the same things that we ask from God? And then the fourth type of law is laws of holiness. Laws that separate us from the animals or separate us from other peoples. They are part of just what make the Jewish people who they are. Okay? So, does this law make sense from an ethical perspective?
Rabbi, I came in late, so I don't know what law you're talking about.
We're talking about the law in Leviticus 18, which says, do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is toeva, an abhorrence.
Ooh, okay.
Right? So that's, so the question I'm asking is it possible to read that as an ethical kind of law?
Science has come a long way since the time of the Torah. And most people, I shouldn't say most people, many people agree that you're born with a certain sexual orientation. That's how you are born.
Mm-hmm.
That may not have been understood in the times of the Torah.
Okay.
And people claim they're pedophiles. They claim that they kleptomanic because it was part of their genes.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah,
there's a lot of things.
So
But that's
then
part
the
of why we have
question
laws to keep us.
is, thank you, Steve. So if someone has inclinations that are different from those of the average person, are we simply going to accept that the Torah allows us to legislate that those people may not act on those inclinations or even those compulsions? Yes, Shelley.
Well, I don't think you can make that argument. You know, people throughout the Bible are born with certain inclinations. Esau was inclined to be a hunter, so he probably would not make a good administrator. David had red hair. He was inclined to kill people, so he made a certain kind of king. You can't really say because you have a genetic endowment, ethical laws don't apply to you. In fact, I would say almost all of us have some genetic inclination to do something that's not good for us or not good for society. So pretty much, given that fact, all ethical laws would go out the window because there'd be an exception for everybody. So I don't. And secondly, we know enough about genetics to know that genetics are complicated. There's epigenetics and the environment that even if you have a gene for something doesn't mean you're going to do that. And it's certainly, I don't see how you could let someone off the hook because they have a genetic predisposition. In fact, people who may have red hair or a tendency to murder may become a shohet rather than a rabbi, for example, because then they can slaughter animals and take their genetic inclination and put it to a constructive use. So I think that science is not going to get you relief from your ethical obligations as outlined in the Torah.
Right. So then let's apply this to specifically our verse in the Torah. Are we going to say that people need to live alone and live a life without sex if homosexuality is prohibited? And by the way, just so you know, this verse, almost every halakhic authority understands this verse as applying specifically to male homosexuality. The prohibition, such as it existed, of female homosexuality was totally rabbinic.
Wow.
Rabbi?
Yes, Francois.
Okay, so it does mention when the Torah mentioned about the prohibition of the same sex, the next line they were prohibiting as well sex with the animals. So I think we are, as a human now, we're picking and choose, like, okay, we can talk about the same sex, but we're not talking about having sex with animals. I mean, they're all the same category. They were mentioned together, okay?
Right.
And, if we want to talk about the same sex, we need to talk about all of those, where it come with it, as well as sex with the animals and everything as well.
Okay.
Mentioned in this paragraph.
And for that matter, you can apply that to the entire Torah, right? There, all the laws of the Torah are part of the Torah. Right?
No, because this is specifically actually were set together. So this is why I'm kind of like,
All right. So, but the fact remains that there are, the text of the Torah is not more sanctified in one place and less sanctified in the other. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a mitzvah in the Torah, then it's a mitzvah. Right? Now, I'm going to come back to that at the end of our discussion, Francois. So hold that issue for a while, okay? I'm granting your point. I'm even strengthening your point.
Mhm.
But I'm going to come back to that later on. Okay? So if you are talking about homosexuality, and let's assume that this is a consenting relationship, because if it's not a consenting relationship, then we obviously have ethical problems with it, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Everyone would. Right?
Yes.
So is it ethically problematic for homosexuals to have a sexual relationship? Anyone want to make a case for that?
Rabbi,
What?
the commandment that God gave Noah right after departing the ark was be fruitful and multiply.
What?
Homosexual relationship does no multiply.
Okay, but
Oh.
that's true also after a certain age, right?
Well, Ben Franklin had his last child at 81.
I'm sorry?
Ben Franklin had his last child at 81. And
Well, that's nice.
Okay.
basically born when Abraham was
Bully for Ben Franklin. Let's hear it for the founding fathers. However,
Okay.
you know, how do I say this delicately?
We're all adults.
We are all adults.
What about just for love?
Well, yeah. So what if you are, what if both the man and his wife are past the age where either of them is going to bear children? Patriarchal and matriarchal exceptions aside, still, you know, those who are of a certain age are not deprived of a sexual relationship. In fact, you know, our tradition says sex should continue in marriage for as long as the parties want it, which should be forever, right? To 120. I'm sorry?
Is that before or after COVID-19?
Well, it's not during. We won't go there, but let's leave it at that.
So I was going to argue, perhaps from a societal point of view, from a community point of view, the fact that a family unit, that the husband and wife, the male and female, play a key role, as we've seen in the Bible also, and going outside of that doesn't contribute. So you can argue on one hand it's a personal, you know, prerogative, but in this case it says you put the community, you know, family units, never, you know, before your own pleasure, if you will.
I know of couples who are male homosexuals who have children who are very loving.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
So, yeah,
They're a family unit.
I'm just, you know, I just put the question out there, Lily.
But you're talking about adoption, other things that weren't part of society, you know, 2,000 years ago.
You don't think people adopted children back then? Of course they adopted
Not that I know of.
children.
I'm sure they did.
Sure they did.
I'm sure that two men did not adopt a child in biblical times.
Well,
I'm
we're
not even sure
we're
male
not in
and
It
female
biblical
might have
times.
been rare.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a problem. So, you know, there's the commandments, okay? And God wants us, when we go to Israel, to follow those commandments so we can have a holy nation and so he can dwell with us. Now, the problem is, okay, if someone want to be bisexual, they can do it somewhere else.
Okay, Francois, I got to stop you there because that's not really I mean, unless you're making an argument for this law as a law of holiness, right? That's fine, and that is plausible. But so far, I haven't heard an argument against this law as being ethical. Okay? Now, second kind of law, national. I don't see any reason to claim that as a specific national law of the Jewish people. Reflexive, theoretically, possibly something to make us think about what the purpose of our sexual lives should be. But again, if there is, if someone has a natural inclination for homosexual desire, that's, I don't see this law as serving a reflexive purpose.
I think what they're trying to refer to particularly are the so-called ritual practices of the non-Israelite nations in which there was homosexual activity more than what goes on in the privacy of your own dwelling.
Yes. Okay, so what you are already doing, you are about a step and a half ahead of me here. And what you are doing is you are placing a limitation around this law. I'm not going to say that that's unreasonable, because I think a lot of scholars have tried to do that. Okay? They say it doesn't mean all male homosexual sex. It's just that the context to which they were referring was a specific kind of sex, which might be ritual or what we would call cultic sex. Fertility cults in particular, where both heterosexual and homosexual activity was at least occasionally a part of the program.
Rabbi?
Yes,
Rabbi.
Lenny.
This is not a judgment on anything. It's just what I've read is that there's nothing wrong with two men loving each other. For instance, like
Jonathan and David.
Jonathan and David. It says their love was greater than whatever. Their love was they had a tremendous love for each other, but the actual physical act of homosexuality is what's prohibited. It's if men can love each other, it's
Okay.
just the physical act that's prohibited.
Right. So two comments. One, I am blanking on the name of a novel about King David, which presumes that in fact it was a homosexual love between David and Jonathan.
Well, yeah, they'll write those kind of, anybody can write.
Yeah, but it may have been that David was,
Well, maybe that was a bad example.
We know he had many wives. Maybe he had a friend on the side too. But the second thing, and this is really more important, Lenny. The issue is, what kind of law is this? What's the purpose of it? If it's something to say that people have to limit certain desires just because, for many of us, we're Jews. We're supposed to ask questions about these things, right? So I need to understand more than just to say, well, the law is the law and I'm not allowed to act on it. I mean, we don't say that about most laws. Yes, Shelley.
Well, actually, we do say that about a lot of laws. You're like, you don't eat cheeseburgers. I mean, it's hard to find a rational explanation for not eating cheeseburgers. The presumption, and so your construct.
I'm sorry, we missed Parshat Shmini. And again, I remind you that, you will have to wait a whole year for me to give a rational reason for not eating cheeseburgers.
All right, let me back up then and say this. The presumption is the Torah is an instruction manual to us for how to live. By count, there's 613 mitzvot. It's a given. We will not always obey them. It'd be virtually impossible to obey all 116 mitzvot all the time. So the presumption is having homosexual sex is not the preferred way of being, according to God's word to Moses. So therefore, you can give a construct as to why it's not the preferred way of being, or why there's a rationale for it could be the preferred way of being, but you still have the fundamental problem that the Torah says that is not the preferred way of being. You say, well, it doesn't fit into one of these 4 classifications. Your response is, well, it may not. That doesn't negate the fact that this was the word given to us, and we have to try to clarify why that might actually be a preferred method of being.
Okay, Rabbi?
Well, Rabbi,
So I haven't heard the method, the reason for it yet.
I'm not offering an ethical reason.
I understand.
A statement of fact.
But I'm still leaving the floor open if somebody has a serious suggestion about that.
So where does
it's already on to limitations.
okay.
Rabbi?
Ronnie.
Yes. Okay, isn't the first mitzvot mentioned in the Torah be fruitful and multiply? Or one of the first?
Well, it's not put specifically to the Jewish people, but yes.
Okay, so that might be a reason why, not that I agree, that homosexual couples would be an aberration.
By the same rationale, Ronnie, I would then have to say that, once you get past the age of childbearing, then there's no further purpose in sex.
True.
Jonathan, you had a question, and then Richard.
No, I was trying to stay within the context of what you're asking, and I think don't you have to read this one verse? I'm sorry, I came in a little late. Within the context of the verses around it, less than 2 verses later, it talks about the national law. You are casting, don't be like the nations. You can read it directly. You must not defile yourself of any of these things, for the nations whom I'm sending out before them have defiled themselves. I'm casting out these nations.
Yeah, the land of them.
Therefore, don't defile yourself. It's a national law to be a nation, right? You have to distinguish yourself, like at the end of Shabbat. We are separate from them. So to me, there's a contextual nature to this, given the nature of idolatry, given the nature of these rituals, which were a case of defilement. So to me, that's where the law comes into account. And there's a lot of mitzvot, a lot of laws.
Okay, so this is really this interesting to me, because this is the first coherent argument that I've ever heard for reading this as a national law. Now, where I think it might break down is that if you read this entire portion, most of these laws do not strike me as having specifically Jewish content. Right? And I think that while they are directed to the Jewish people, they aren't all framed in a way that says this is behavior that is only restricted to Jews, but it's not at least a little questionable for other people.
Rabbi.
Yeah, Richard, you're up.
Okay. If that was Jonathan Bailiff, he took some of the words out of my mouth, because I look at this as a national law, and in an analogous situation, we have our Constitution of the United States, written 200 and something years ago. That Constitution contains a number of things which, when we look at it later on, for example, that not giving women the right to vote, being a property owner as the condition of voting, or a whole bunch of things, including slavery. We need to, in my view, need to look at the Torah as a living document, as a document that is not static. Because if it's static, then many times you get stuck in the ditch of defilement, and you get this stuck in the ditch of how do you address these nowadays? And candidly, the United Synagogue Law Committee, Rabbinical Assembly Law Committee faced this and had a lot of dissent all over the place, as you know, and you can talk about that. But to me, for the Torah to be meaningful, you have to put it in the context of a living document to be looked at in terms of the 21st century. Otherwise, you may be stuck way back. And my sister made really a great point, because nowadays we're much more sensitive to people who have loving relationships. And we in our current society in the United States Supreme Court has done is to say, yes, we recognize loving relationships, we recognize humanity, and we recognize and respect people's inherent personalities, inherent bodies. And if they have inherently this nature, then we respect that, and we don't condemn it, which is a whole different attitude than what is contained in 22.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. The, Richard refers to the discussions in the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards that took place in 2006, where two opposing positions were passed, each one by a vote of 13 to 12. Now you ask, how can two opposing positions be passed by the exact same vote? Well, of course, they don't vote on issues, they vote on papers. And some people will say, well, elu ve'elu, these and these are the words of the living God. So one person voted for both papers and both approaches and said they're both valid approaches. But to say that it was a matter of dispute is definitely an understatement. Yes, Shelley.
Well, I want to go back to your issue. You don't hear an ethical argument. Ethics relates to morality. Morality is essentially what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. In this context, the Torah is saying the homosexual act is not good and it's wrong. That pretty much is a definition of morality from the Torah's point of view. So I don't see why you don't accept that as an ethical argument.
I guess I
agree with it.
I need to hear a little more explanation as to why it's an abomination or
the Torah as a guideline. The Torah as a guideline to what's right and wrong.
In other words, because the Torah says it's moral.
So,
and if it's wrong according to the Torah, then it's immoral. Now, I don't read the law that way.
I don't read it.
And I'll give you an example, all right? Shelley, do you know any Jews who eat chametz on Pesach?
Yes.
Okay. Is it unethical to eat chametz on Pesach?
Yes.
It's prohibited.
As a rabbi, I have a very hard time making an argument that you don't eat chametz because it's unethical.
You eat it because it's prohibited.
But you don't eat
no
it?
distinction between the law and ethics. I mean, if it's ethical, It's legal. If it's legal, it's ethical.
No.
Unethical.
No.
I think the
No.
law is a very
No.
substitute
Well,
for ethics.
Shelley, you know, that is one view of the Torah, and I am sure there are lots of Jews who share that view. You're hearing that there are lots of Jews who do not share that view.
What's
I
the
didn't-
justification for mikvah?
Steve, please.
Yeah, when you look at mikvah, you know, why do we do mikvah? Because Parsha is elevating life, elevating to a higher level. And I would argue part of behavior, I think, is also family units. I think it's a little bit of what, you know, what's said before, that as far as building families and community, and I think there's a balance in Judaism between communal and individual. And I think what you're seeing with some of the acceptance of this is more of a jiggering, that Judaism over the years is accepting more of the individual to the detriment of the community a little bit. But there's always a balance on there.
Yeah, that's
Rabbi.
what groups of rabbis who have to legislate on such issues have to consider. You know, they may have a hard time saying that it's unethical, but, you know, does that mean that it's acceptable?
Okay, Rabbi?
Yes, Francois.
So eating, this is very, we cannot compare those two together because eating chametz during Pesach is unethical, correct? Because the punishment of someone eating Pesach, chametz, is, I think, throwing this person out of the community for a whole week, or it's not punishable by death. However, the homosexuality is punishable by death. Now, one thing I would like to mention, even though it wasn't mentioned in Torah, we all have brain that there's a law of nature. Like just thinking about the law of nature, there's boy, there's a girl. Even if it wasn't mentioned in Torah, we can tell, like I believe, an ordinary person, that we're supposed to have like the sex between boy and a girl, and when we and not different than this.
Where are you deriving that?
From just like law of nature.
No, it's not a law of nature. Okay.
No,
So,
even animals exhibit
so let me speak.
homosexuality.
I'll deviate a little bit, but just to comment on it, you know,
No.
I'm a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and I've had many over the years, many homosexual and lesbian patients. And I can tell you that the vast majority knew by the time they were 4 or 5 years old, not that they were homosexual because they didn't have the concept, but they knew that they were different than the other kids of the same sex. And
Yes.
all of our cross-cultural studies that we've done, you know, from South America, China, places where homosexuality can be talked about. Obviously, you can't do a study in Saudi Arabia. You get your head chopped off, okay? But yet there are gays in Saudi Arabia. I read a wonderful article in the New Yorker many years ago about that. Even in Saudi Arabia, they've learned how to tolerate that as long as they don't call attention to it. But
May I comment on Stephen?
Hold on. Are you finished, Dave?
So my point is, it's not a law of nature because these people knew at the dawning of their consciousness, okay, that they were attracted, okay, to the same sex, okay. It's not a choice. It's not a decision. Many fought with it for years. If I'm not mistaken, the famous Broadway songwriter Stephen Sondheim struggled with his homosexuality till he was 50 years old before he finally came out of the closet. Okay.
Go ahead and finish, please, Steve, and then Bonnie, if you'll hold on, I want to move into
around 5 or 6 years old. They sensed there was something inherently different about them, and what our cross-cultural studies show is consistent is certain behaviors. When you look at boys who we know later become homosexual, that their preference at 5 and 6 is to avoid a type of play that we call RTP, or rough and tumble play. And you see that in every culture. And that boys begin to avoid the typical roughhousing that most 6, 7, 8-year-old boys do. They tend to prefer girls' games. And you can see this, I said, really at the beginning of a child's kind of consciousness of who they are. Okay.
Okay.
So
May I understand?
It's not a law of nature.
Now, I understand that there are aspects of this.
You know, if you want to blind yourself, yes, you can say it's a law of nature. Okay. But if you want to talk to homosexuals and you really study them, you find
Rabbi.
Please.
Okay, I'm waiting.
I want to try to move forward from this because I recognize that we're not going to come to a resolution about how we think about homosexuality. That's not my purpose for raising it. What I want to do is to show how we have dealt with the law among those who were willing to say that maybe there's some flexibility here for one reason or another. So there are several possible ways that you can approach the text of the Torah and its laws. Traditionalists say, you got to live by the law. You know, accept no compromise, no matter how painful it is, because God gave you the law, and that's what it is.
Nope.
Sometimes there's flexibility in individual situations. You know, this same portion tells us that we're supposed to fast on Yom Kippur, all right? But we all know that there are people who, under certain circumstances, are not even allowed to fast, let alone, you know, that we would force them to. Even if someone really wants to fast, if the doctor says they can't, then they can't, and that's that. Some would suggest that in the case of this law, the Torah bases its position on an assumption that is no longer viable. So for instance, the Torah assumed that this was an unnatural act because in the context of cultic sex, that's what it was. If you see homosexual sex as natural in certain contexts, then for those people, maybe the law doesn't apply. And finally, there are those who would say, well, if that's the case, we should sanctify gay relationships. Okay? Now, wherever you stand on this, I would hope that, you know, there are certain things that everyone would agree upon, which would be that every person is created in God's image. Every person should be welcomed in the synagogue. Every person should be treated with dignity. All right? Mm-hmm. Now, you know, we can all disagree about how to interpret this particular law, but we should, I would hope we would all agree that we don't use the law to marginalize any individual, right? And that we see God's image in everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, right? So, what are the ways in which we've tried to reinterpret this law? Okay, so going back to your study guide, right? One approach was, it was kind of, it's been suggested here already, but this is the approach of Dr. Avi Rose, who wrote that the context of the rule was you don't practice the practices of other nations, right? Which would be, in this case, cultic sex, right? And so if you take homosexual activity out of that context, then perhaps you have an argument that says it could be permitted, all right? I hear a little bit of sympathy tonight for those who have homosexual inclinations. Why shouldn't they have love? For this position, I bring to your attention this prayer that was written by Rabbi Steve Greenberg, an ordained Orthodox rabbi who also happens to be gay.
Oh, wow.
And this prayer I heard a few years ago when I went to teach in another synagogue, and the cantor was gay. And he read this passage, this piece by Rabbi Greenberg, before the Torah reading. Okay? So, you know, Master of the universe, to whom all secrets are known, before you we stand both confused and undaunted. Right? In other words, confused because here the Torah says we can't do what we are, and undaunted because we know what we are. Right? And he takes the position that this is an appropriate prayer to read before this segment of the Torah, right? As a way of making it clear that we don't marginalize any member of the community just because they happen to be gay. Right? I'm going to put down this. Lily asks me a question about the law in the Torah about stoning a disobeying son. Right? And yes, not only, I mean, did the sages write that out of practice, but also probably was never, ever a law that was practiced. Right? So, occasionally, the rabbis felt that they had the right to take certain laws, even though they were in the Torah, and even if they had a reason. Right? After all, the rebellious son is somebody who does certain things that are unethical. Right? And hardly anyone, except maybe the rebellious sons among us, would argue that they're unethical. But at the same time, they legislated it out of the Torah. And we're going to see a couple of other examples of that as well. Yes, Shelley.
I think there's confusion in our discussion between the unethical behavior, the person doing the behavior, and the punishment for the behavior. Those are not the same thing. I'll give you an example. This is Stephen Greenberg's book, Wrestling with God and Men. As it turns out, I studied for quite a few years with Stephen Greenberg. He used to come down here and teach Torah. He was a very nice man, a very nice Torah teacher. He used to go write a blog or whatever he did back then under the name of Levado, alone, because he felt alone as a gay homosexual rabbi. There was no, as far as I know at the time, there was no minyan for gay homosexual Orthodox Jews. The point is, he's a very nice guy. He himself was struggling with the notion that what he was doing, was it unethical or not? Nothing about Steve himself. He's a great guy and a good Torah scholar. No one was suggesting Steve be stoned or anything else. But he himself acknowledged it was a real ethical dilemma to be an Orthodox Jew and homosexual. And this book is a good book if you're really interested in the topic. It's called
Well, I think that maybe Rabbi Greenberg's prayer is the answer to that struggle that he had.
Perhaps. Well, he had resolved it, and he came out and, you know, he made it clear all the issues you have being a gay Orthodox rabbi. The point being, none of that negates what the Torah says. You can have sympathy for the gay individual. You can say punishing them is inappropriate. You can't make it into an acceptable behavior just because you don't want to punish them in any way or don't think they deserve punishment or because you like them. There's nothing about them as a person. We all do unethical things all the time. How many times a day do we gossip? I mean, just it's endless, the number of unethical things we do. And yet,
hey, Shelley, speak for yourself, okay?
I am speaking for myself. So
I appreciate the honesty.
Conflating those three issues, the person, the unethical behavior, and the punishment, gets very confusing as to what the real issue is, which is what is the status of that kind of behavior? Not its punishment, not the person.
Right, and I'm not talking here primarily about punishment. I'm talking about how we deal with a law of the Torah that is itself problematic.
Yes, but that conversation, how do you deal with the person who violates that law, which is a separate issue than the law itself? That's all. Because you start, is there an ethical basis for it? I'm saying, yes, there is.
Well, I'm not so sure that you can create such a, you know, a fine distinction. I think that, you know, for at least some...
Rabbi, you asked about the law. You didn't ask about the person or about the punishment. You asked about the law itself, so I'm focusing on that.
Yes, I understand, but I think that how we think about the law has an effect on how we think about the person who violates it, right?
It's the opposite. How we think about the person.
The guy who,
affects how we think about the law.
the guy who eats a cheeseburger, right? You gave the example, right? So, you know, I'm not prepared to say that that is an unethical person, right? Obviously, I'm not in favor of eating cheeseburgers, right?
Would you consider an unethical behavior?
No, not necessarily. I think the only argument you can make for it is, I mean, you know, we're not talking about somebody who says that they don't do it and then they do it, right? That's something else entirely.
The lying would be unethical.
Yeah, right. But
oppressing the poor. That's you know, unethical, or not paying your
synagogue dues
in a timely manner.
But there are times when lying would definitely be ethical.
I think we all have some understanding of what ethical laws are. I'm just not convinced that a law is, on the face of it, unethical simply because the Torah says it's unethical. It says you can't do it.
Well, then what would be the source of ethics in the Jewish religion other than the Torah?
Oh, I'm not saying that ethics is the only thing that comes from the Torah. Do you understand the distinctions, Shelley?
Not yet, no, I'm sorry.
Okay, so
what's the source of ethics if not the Torah?
I'm not arguing that the Torah is the source of ethics. I am saying that the Torah is the source of just about everything Jewish.
Rabbi.
And that there is more to being Jewish than ethics, right? Is it unethical not to come to synagogue on Saturday morning?
maybe rabbinically, maybe.
Oh, jeez.
Where's the Torah say you got? I don't recall the Torah saying you have to come to synagogue.
If we're going to make the laws of the Torah as the arbiter for ethics, right? So then what's going to happen is we're going to stone people for gathering sticks on Shabbat.
I think it's the other way around.
I don't know about you, but I have a serious problem with that. Most of all, because I would lose my job. If I killed somebody for gathering sticks on Shabbat, you would run me out into jail.
Yes.
But it's a law in the Torah.
It is a law in the Torah. The application of the law and the punishment for the law is a different matter. It doesn't make the law itself unethical.
I assure you, Shelley, I assure you that there are people in the Jewish world today who very much believe in the application of that law.
Yes, but normative Judaism tells us that there are punishments which are not necessarily applied because they're much too extreme after considering it for hundreds of years. But I think the point is you don't start from the Torah has to explain why it's ethical. I think you have to explain why that particular law is unethical. Not that what's wrong with the Torah, it's why is it unethical?
Or I can take a different approach and say, in what context would that be an ethical law? And that, I think, is the argument that Lenny made and that Dr. Rose makes. Because we have 5 minutes remaining, and we're clearly not going to get to everything that I had planned, I just want to show you the structure of the argument given in the last piece here by Dr. Benjamin Sommer. So he takes the law in Exodus 22, which says, you may not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You should throw it to dogs. Right? That refers to trefa. Right? And then Deuteronomy chapter 14 says this is also true for animals that die a natural death. Right? So if you look earlier in our Parsha, you have something that runs counter to those laws about trefa and nevela. Right? So if you eat such an animal, it doesn't assume that you can't. It just says if you eat such an animal, then you wash your clothes, bathe in water, remain ritually impure until evening, and then you are ritually pure. And that applies not only to you, but to the stranger living within your community. So according to this verse, they are allowed. Jews are allowed to eat both nevela and trefa. Okay? Now, all of you who practice Judaism today, you know that that's not the law. Right? So what happened? Something changed. Right? Something changed. Right? And so to cut to, about the middle of Dr. Sommer's piece, he says Jewish legal practice did not remain open to this difference. No Jewish authority in the past 25 centuries or so permits Jews to eat meat from an animal as nevela or trefa that has died naturally or was killed by other animals. Right? But the verse from Leviticus is still part of Leviticus. It's part of the Torah. It has no legal authority. Now, if this was the direction you might have been driving at, Shelley, that's okay. Maybe this is the approach that some people would advocate for dealing with homosexuality, which is, we know that this is in the Torah, but nonetheless, it is not enforced, and we no longer regard it the same way as we regard other laws from the Torah. Okay? And Dr. Summer goes a little farther than that. As many of us have come to view homosexual relationships, behaviors, and orientations as morally equal to heterosexual ones. Right? And so, how do we go forward with this? We just, we accept the fact that the law changes under certain conditions, or minimally, the law is no longer enforced.
Rabbi.
We have time for a couple of comments. Steve?
Can I make one quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie.
Okay, in response to what Stephen said, I taught Montessori for over 40 years. And over that period of time, I had children at 3 years old that were obviously gay, obviously homosexual. And having followed some of them through adulthood, I was right. It was so obvious, even at that young age.
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yeah, Lenny.
Rabbi, I'm a little disappointed that this was our whole focus tonight. I had come prepared with a lot of information on the rest of this Torah portion, but what I wanted to point out with all the back and forth and the ambiguity that everybody's expressing here is, I think what we need to keep in mind about the Torah is that we've got laws, from what I understand, laws and decrees in the Torah. And the laws are things that are practices that are dictated to us, like prohibition of robbery, no idolatry, no bloodshed. And then we've got decrees which are beyond human intelligence, such as prohibition on eating torn flesh, like you said, on forbidden meat, not wearing linen and wool. We don't understand what that is, but there's lots of things we don't understand in the Torah. And from what I understand from my reading is that these are God's decrees, and it's not for us to decide if they're worthy of our approval. And that's the only thought. That's the thought I want to leave everybody with.
So Lenny, let me just. I understand that position completely. I'm not here to try to talk you out of it. Okay. I typically in this class have taken one verse or one issue within the Torah portion. I usually don't take the most controversial thing, but once in a while, So I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance to bring up some of the other things you would like to.
I wanted to talk about the goats, the sacrifices.
Yeah. Clearly, this is an issue where not everyone, even in the Orthodox world, is prepared to accept that these are God's decrees and that's it.
Rabbi Danny?
So they're beyond our
yeah, Francois, and then maybe one more, and then we'll
you
end
see,
for tonight.
If we keep overriding laws, we're going to keep doing this, and eventually we're going to have nothing left. And the Torah mentioned, don't add and don't subtract. So just because this is like the problem is like, you change something and then you other things has to be changed later on in the future, and then a few hundred years from now, nothing left to be taken seriously.
I know. And that's a problem that the rabbis who legislate the law have to be very conscious of. You know, in 1950, we passed a law that legitimated driving to and from synagogue.
Ooh.
On Shabbat and Yom Tov. See where that got us. Now the floodgates are open and everything is permitted. Right?
Okay.
And by the way, I would argue that this is also a consideration with certain issues relating to egalitarianism. And I'm not referring to, those things just as they apply in the chapel, but as they apply in congregations around the country. I think a lot of people believe that one change, even if it is justified in Jewish law, should not be permitted. Why? Because it will change our religion beyond recognition, and it will undermine the authority of everything we teach and do, and therefore you have a problem. So I'm not denying that there are risks associated with taking a position in favor of a change in Jewish law. That's, and that's all I'll say about it for the rest of tonight. Shelley, you get the last word.
I was just going to change the topic, pick up on what Lenny said about.
Well, that's all the time we have for tonight.
Other things. Last week's Torah portion about Metzora, if you read it carefully, it talks about social distancing and wearing masks. It says, the person with Tzarat, the Metzora, in whom there is a lesion, he shall cover himself up to his lips and call out, unclean, unclean. So and there's other Ramban, Ralbag, many other people commenting upon isolation and social distancing for the person considered to have some unknown kind of contagion. So I just want to bring that up. If you want to reread last week's Torah,
thank you, Lily.
You can learn a lot about what's going on those past few months around the world with COVID.
Oh yeah.
Quarantine has been the primary and oldest form of stopping the spread of contagion. The Israelites in the desert kicked them out of the camp and told them to go stay away or whatever. But the point is, we're only practicing an old practice.
Just cover your lips. I advise against calling people unclean, though.
Bob
I won't get
and Aurora, I see that somebody has a question there. So I'll one more. Yeah, Bob. You have to unmute yourself if you haven't already. Well, that's it, folks. Bob, thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a lively discussion.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. See you next Thursday.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
All right.